"Don't get in the car." The voice came from somewhere behind him, small, trembling, yet clear enough to slice through the noise of the city. A billionaire businessman stopped mid-step, his hand hovering just above the car door, confused by the words that didn't belong. He turned and saw her, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, standing at the edge of the parking lot, her backpack slung over one shoulder and fear written all over her face. And what she said next would change everything. "I heard them talking," she whispered. "Your bodyguards. They were speaking Chinese. They said your car will explode when you start it." In that instant, the world around him froze. The murmuring guards, the hum of traffic, even the cold wind felt heavier. He stared at her, this child who shouldn't even know such things, and for the first time in years, the man who thought he controlled everything felt powerless. Because sometimes truth doesn't come from power, it comes from innocence. Now imagine being in his place. You've built your entire life believing loyalty could be bought, that money equals safety, and that control means survival. But what if the danger isn't outside your walls? It's standing inside them, smiling at you every day. What if the only person brave enough to save you is the one voice no one else is willing to listen to? This story isn't about wealth or power. It's about what happens when those illusions collapse, when a child's courage reveals the darkness adults pretend not to see. The girl's warning wasn't just a moment of bravery. It was the spark that forced a man to face everything he had ignored: betrayal, fear, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes innocence sees more clearly than experience ever could. And that's what makes this story unforgettable. A single moment, a quiet voice in the chaos, that changed the course of a man's life. But behind that moment lies a lesson for all of us. Never underestimate the power of speaking up, and never silence the voice that tells you something isn't right, because in the next few minutes, you'll see how one little girl's courage exposed a web of lies, saved a man's life, and proved that truth doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it whispers. So, before we dive into this incredible story, I have a quick favor to ask. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and hit the like button if you believe courage still matters in this world. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Which country? Which city? I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now get ready, because once you hear what really happened after that little girl said, "Don't get in the car," you'll never forget it. He didn't think of himself as a villain, not even as a hero. Just a man who had long ago made a bargain with time. Richard Cole, whose name floated across financial tickers and tech blogs like a neon marquee, stepped onto the 39th floor lobby of Cole Tech Tower, with the same composed cadence he used to cross every threshold in his life. Manhattan's late November wind had been tapping on the glass all afternoon, a thin-fingered drummer announcing winter's rehearsal, and the building answered with the hush of conditioned air, marble underfoot, and the soft thrum of elevators that knew everyone's place. Richard liked order, not the brittle kind that cracks under pressure, but the engineered kind that bends, rebalances, and holds. His suit, charcoal with a quiet pinstripe, sat on him like a second decision. His tie was disciplined. His cufflinks held the day together. He had spent the last 3 hours speaking in numbers and forecasts, shaping the world with phrases like runway, roadmap, and horizon. Words were tools. People were partnerships. Risk was a currency you spent only if the return was certain. Around him moved the invisible choreography of power, assistants gliding with tablets, receptionists speaking in that elegant, professional tone that says everything and promises nothing, and a line of holiday poinsettias trying their best to be cheerful in a room that didn't really need cheering. By the revolving doors, his security team, Mark, Ian, Zhao, and Lucas, held the perimeter with the kind of loose-shouldered ease that only looks casual when it's learned the hard way. They were the buffer between him and chance, between control and its opposite. He respected them as one respects a fire escape, grateful, but hoping never to need it. And if you had been there in that lobby, you would have noticed what he noticed every day without noticing, how the city outside threw itself at the glass and broke into reflections, how the world inside responded with gleaming surfaces and soft lighting, light bouncing off light until even the quiet felt curated. Richard Cole's ordinary world was polished, predictable, and carefully defended, which is to say it was stable in all the ways a storm eye seems stable. Calm because chaos spins just out of sight. And if he sometimes felt a small, almost private ache, a memory of a younger man standing in line for a library card, promising himself he wouldn't be small forever, he tucked it away like the note in his breast pocket, the one with tomorrow's meetings and tonight's dinner. Because in a life like his, sentiment wasn't strategy, and strategy was how you kept everything from slipping. 2 blocks away, the city told a kinder story in smaller letters. Emily Parker wasn't famous anywhere that printed magazines, but she was well known on the corner of 58th and 6th, where the doorman at the Park Rowan nodded to her like she was royalty, and the florist on the curb kept a single stem aside, just in case. Emily moved through the dusk with that attentive bounce only 7-year-olds and certain sparrows possess, her green coat buttoned crooked because she had insisted on doing it herself, and a knit hat tugged low like a secret. She carried a worn canvas backpack that smelled faintly of crayons and cinnamon, the first because of school, the second because Grandma Lee May had pulled a fresh batch of spiral buns from the oven and insisted she take 2 in case the city gets hungry. The city often got hungry. Emily's ordinary world wasn't marble and glass. It was steam rising from subway grates and the squeak of rubber soles in school hallways, the hum of corner delis and the rhythm of Mandarin at home, tones rising and falling like a lullaby with homework. Lee May said language was a bridge and a lantern. It helped you cross and it helped you see. So Emily practiced characters on scrap paper, copied proverbs into a purple notebook, and listened. She listened to the street musicians who turned the subway into a theater, to pigeons scolding one another like tiny, feathery aunties, to grown-ups who thought children could only hear when spoken to. She listened because Grandma had told her something most adults forget. Listening is a kind of bravery. It means you're willing to be changed. On Tuesdays, after school, she and Grandma stopped by the Midtown Library to return books and borrow more. Today had been such a Tuesday, and Emily had lingered in the children's section until the light outside slipped from silver to pewter. They left with a stack of mysteries and a biography of an astronaut who had once looked back at Earth and called it fragile. Fragile, Grandma said, rolling the word in English like a pearl in her mouth. That means we must hold carefully. Emily liked holding carefully, paper cups of hot chocolate, a friend's secret, a stray ladybug found in winter as if summer had misplaced it. She did not know the name Richard Cole, nor did she know that she would soon say his name like a promise. But in her small, bright universe, certain rules had already taken root. Tell the truth. Use both hands when the bowl is full. And if you can stop something bad from happening, you must speak up, even if your voice shakes. That last rule lived in her like a candle, steady, warm, the kind of light you don't notice until the room dims. Down in the tower's parking level, the ordinary world kept its own clock. Concrete swallowed sound, and the air layered itself, cold near the ramps, warmer near the vents, while the building's lungs exhaled with mechanical regularity. The scent was a cocktail of rubber, engine heat, and the faint cologne that clung to luxury sedans the way pride clings to achievement. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and every few seconds the elevator chimed, a quiet bell marking transitions that mattered to someone. David Miller, Richard's chief of staff, and the only person allowed to edit his schedule without asking, flipped through messages on his phone as he waited by the car. A deep graphite sedan with a quiet confidence and a security package that could have guarded a diplomat. David's ordinary world was measured in contingencies. If this, then that. If no, then who. If late, then what gets moved. He knew where Richard liked to sit in the car, right rear, how he preferred the thermostat, a notch warmer in winter. I'd rather think than shiver. And which routes avoided the worst of the city's stubborn arteries at 5:30 on a Tuesday. The 4 bodyguards split their attention with professional grace. Mark and Ian scanning the lane for movement, Zhao and Lucas tracking approach vectors that existed mostly in their peripheral vision. If you're picturing men with stern faces and earpieces, you aren't wrong, but it would be a mistake to reduce them to props. They were human. Mark, a father who kept a folded drawing in his wallet. Ian, a runner who timed his tours by breaths. Zhao, a careful watcher whose Mandarin came not from textbooks but from home. Lucas, the youngest, still learning how to move like water instead of stone. They joked, sometimes. They also noticed. And that was the parking level's lullaby. Noticing, deciding, resetting. Up above, in the glass-bright lobby, Richard paused to answer one last question from the VP of Operations. The kind of question that proves the asker has been paying attention and the listener isn't too important to answer. "We'll revisit in Q1, he said, a diplomatic promise dressed as time. Then the elevators opened with a sigh, the kind that suggests a story is turning a page. He stepped in with the practiced economy of a man who trusts doors to open when he needs them to, the city's winter light breaking across the steel like water. Somewhere between floor 39 and the garage, the day's noise thinned until even his thoughts sounded like footsteps in a museum. This, to Richard, was peace, the brief, moving room where no one asks and no one answers, and the next thing to do is simply the next thing. And if, as the elevator descended, a child in a green coat and a knit hat tugged her grandmother's hand a half-block away and looked up at a tower that wore the sky like jewelry, that was only the city braiding its threads, one of 10,000 small coincidences that never feel small to the people inside them. What happened next would belong to another chapter, one where listening becomes courage and ordinary bends toward the extraordinary. But for now, all you need to see is the world as it was, balanced, busy, and held together by the belief that tomorrow looks like today, until someone hears something that changes what tomorrow might be. Sometimes the universe doesn't knock, it whispers. That whisper came from a voice far too small to belong in a place as tall as Coltech Tower. It was late afternoon when the cold started to taste like metal and the first stars tried to survive the city's glare. Richard Cole had just ended a call with a senator, one of those calls that smelled faintly of promises wrapped in protocol, and stepped out toward the private lane where his car waited. The tower glowed behind him, 20 stories of mirrored ambition reflecting the world it helped build. His phone buzzed again, a habit it couldn't quit, and he glanced at the screen, thumb hovering between yes and later. That's when he heard it. A voice, small but firm, cutting through the usual hum of city rhythm. "Sir, please, don't get in your car." It wasn't the kind of voice that begged, it was the kind that believed. He turned, mildly annoyed but curious, and saw her. A little girl in a green coat, hat too big, cheeks flushed from the wind, standing next to an older woman holding a grocery bag that seemed bigger than she was. The contrast was absurd. Billion-dollar man, 7-year-old messenger. And yet something in her eyes froze him. They weren't afraid. They were urgent. "Your guards," she said, pointing at Mark and Ian. They were speaking in Chinese. "They said your car will explode." The word explode didn't belong in the air between them. It cracked the moment like ice underfoot. For a second, he thought he'd misheard, that maybe this was a misunderstanding, a child's imagination fed by too many movies. But the girl wasn't smiling. Her voice trembled just enough to be real. "They said it will happen when you start the engine," she added, switching to Mandarin for a phrase, crisp, fluent, unmistakable. That's what made him pause. Richard spoke enough Mandarin to negotiate contracts, not enough to dream in it. But he knew truth when he heard it in another language. The guards froze too, exchanging glances that didn't mean nothing. And just like that, the temperature in the garage dropped another degree. The called moment is never convenient. It doesn't wait for the calendar to clear. Richard's instinct, polished by years of avoiding disasters measured in stock prices, told him to manage the situation quietly. "Sweetheart," he said, crouching just slightly, voice a fraction gentler. "You must have misheard. My men are—" But he didn't finish. Emily shook her head. "I know what I heard. They said no one would suspect them after the noise. The old woman behind her, Grandma Lee May, stood still, her sharp eyes glancing at each guard in turn. There was an ancient kind of calm in her, the sort that comes from surviving more winters than you can count. "She doesn't lie," she said in accented English. "If she says she heard it, she heard it." Richard's mind spun through possibilities: prank, misunderstanding, corporate sabotage. He wanted to laugh it off, to let logic mop up the fear pooling in the corners of his thoughts. But logic faltered when the smallest person in the room looked utterly certain. He glanced toward David Miller, who had just stepped out of the elevator, and tilted his head subtly, the silent language of men who deal in discretion. The guards stood tense, trying to appear relaxed. "Mr. Cole, is something wrong?" David asked, reading the unease. Richard exhaled slowly. "Maybe," he said, never taking his eyes off the girl. "Maybe something's wrong." The old woman reached for Emily's hand. "We should go," she murmured, but Emily didn't move. "If you get in that car, you'll die," she said quietly, like she was reciting something sacred, and for reasons he couldn't explain, not to himself, not yet, he believed her. The call had been made. He just hadn't decided if he would answer. The strange thing about moments that change everything is that they don't announce themselves with trumpets. They slide in sideways, soft and insistent, and by the time you realize you're standing at a crossroads, the road behind you has already faded. Richard looked at Emily, really looked, and saw not just a child but something unyielding behind her smallness, like truth wearing pigtails. Around them, the hum of the city didn't stop. Cars passed. A man laughed into a phone. Someone spilled coffee nearby. Life continued as if it didn't care that, inside this pocket of silence, the balance of one man's destiny was tilting. "What's your name?" Richard asked. "Emily," she answered. "Emily Parker." The name fit her like a story's first sentence, simple, familiar, but promising something unexpected on the next page. "Emily," he repeated, more to himself than to her. He could dismiss her, let the day continue, and forget this moment by dinner. Or he could listen, really listen, and risk the possibility that she was right. There it was, the hinge between safety and belief, the faint quiver that separates control from courage. He straightened, scanning the faces of his guards. They were too still. And in that stillness, the whisper of danger grew louder than reason. He'd spent a lifetime mastering negotiation, but this was the one deal he couldn't calculate. Trust a stranger, or trust the men paid to protect him. The universe had issued its invitation, neatly wrapped in innocence and fear. All Richard Cole had to do now was decide if he would open it. The air around them felt electric, not loud but waiting, as if the city itself had taken a breath, curious to see which way he'd step next. The refusal of the call. Richard Cole was a man who built his empire by doubting everything first, then deciding. Doubt was, to him, a form of respect. Respect for risk. Respect for reality. It had saved him from scandals, hostile takeovers, and emotional entanglements that might have cost more than money ever could. So when a 7-year-old stranger accused his own bodyguards of plotting his death, the first emotion wasn't fear. It was disbelief. Cold, analytical disbelief. Kids overhear things, he told himself, trying to smooth the edges of unease scraping against his composure. The parking garage was still. Too still. Only the faint hum of fluorescent light and the rhythmic drip of a pipe somewhere broke the silence. "Mr. Cole," David's voice echoed softly, careful, like one speaks near sleeping lions. Richard turned to him, masking tension behind a practiced neutrality. "Everything's fine," he said, though his eyes betrayed calculation. He looked at the guards, Mark, Ian, Zhao, and Lucas, each standing with the posture of men aware of being watched. Zhao's gaze flicked to Emily, then back to Richard. The movement was too precise, too quick, it registered. "Fine," Richard repeated, as though the word could will reality into compliance. Emily's small hands clenched at her sides. You don't believe me, she said. He didn't answer. Adults rarely do when the truth comes from the wrong mouth. Listen, she tried again, stepping closer, voice trembling but clear. They said in Chinese. I understood them. They said, once he starts the car, everything will look like an accident. That line pierced through his reasoning like a hairline crack in glass. Invisible at first, but you know it will spread. Still, habit one. He forced a tight smile. You're a brave girl, he said, kneeling just enough to meet her gaze without conceding authority. But you must have misunderstood. My team would never... He stopped mid-sentence because even his voice didn't sound convinced. When people live surrounded by loyalty paid for in contracts, they forget that trust isn't the same as control. Richard tried to anchor himself in facts. 4 years of service, no incidents, security clearance, background checks. Logic was his compass, and logic pointed away from panic. But reason has a way of sounding hollow when the air itself feels off. His pulse betrayed him, a steady rhythm gone slightly uneven. Let's get you both upstairs, he suggested to the grandmother, gesturing politely. More to end the scene than to solve it. It's late, and I don't want you standing here in this cold. The grandmother looked at him like she'd seen that exact kind of deflection before, from doctors, from bureaucrats, from men who believe power guarantees correctness. Sometimes, she said softly, the truth does not wait for permission. That line unsettled him more than he wanted to admit. It was the kind of sentence that belonged in a philosophy book, not in a parking garage seconds before sunset. David, Richard said, switching back to control mode. Have the car ready. David hesitated, scanning the scene, but nodded. Orders were anchors, and anchors made men feel safe. The guards moved to their positions again, silent and professional. Only Zhao's shoulders were too tight. Only Ian's hand lingered near his jacket pocket a second longer than usual. See? Richard said to Emily, forcing reassurance into his tone. Everything's fine. She shook her head. No, it's not. And somehow that simple contradiction, small voice against the echo of authority, felt louder than anything else in the room. Denial isn't the absence of truth. It's a survival instinct dressed as reason. Richard's mind began weaving excuses faster than fear could untangle them. Maybe she misheard. Maybe Zhao was on a private call. Maybe this is all just noise. He'd spent decades taming chaos with logic, sculpting control from uncertainty, and now he clung to that habit like a man gripping a railing in rough seas. You've had a long day, he told himself. You're tired. You're seeing ghosts. But the ghosts didn't leave. They just changed shape. When he looked at Emily again, her expression didn't match any he'd seen before. Not fear, not defiance, but clarity. Children have a way of cutting through the layers adults build to survive their own doubts. You don't have to believe me, she said, voice small but certain, but please don't start that car. For the first time, Richard noticed her eyes shimmered not with tears but with conviction. That sincerity frightened him more than the accusation itself. The elevator doors pinged behind them, spilling light into the shadows. For a fleeting second, he imagined how ridiculous he must look, one of Forbes's richest men, paralyzed by the words of a girl in a green coat. He almost laughed, almost. But laughter didn't come. Only a long breath that tasted like cold metal and questions he didn't yet know how to ask. Somewhere deep down, beneath the layers of certainty, a whisper began. What if she's right? But Richard Cole wasn't a man who lived on what-ifs. Not yet. So he adjusted his tie, nodded curtly to his men, and said the line that would mark the boundary between the world he knew and the one waiting beyond it. Let's go. And in that instant, when he turned away from truth, the city itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to understand that some refusals cost more than disbelief. Sometimes wisdom doesn't arrive wearing a robe or carrying a staff. Sometimes it wears a winter coat that smells faintly of ginger tea and speaks with the patience of someone who has outlived her own storms. Grandma Li Mei stood beside Emily in that gray, humming parking garage like a piece of stillness dropped into noise. Her silver hair peeked out from a knitted cap, her face drawn in lines that looked less like wrinkles and more like maps, each one leading back to something she had survived. Richard Cole had seen countless people in his life who claimed authority, men who barked orders in boardrooms or on screens. Yet when Li Mei finally spoke, she didn't need volume. Her voice moved through the space like warm water. "Mr. Cole," she said, each word deliberate, each syllable touched by a soft Mandarin melody. "In my country we say, a candle loses nothing by lighting another. Listen to her. It will cost you nothing." Richard hesitated, caught between the steel of his own logic and the quiet gravity of a stranger who radiated truth. David Miller watched him closely, waiting for instruction, but Richard raised a hand. "One moment," he murmured. He crouched a little to meet Emily's eyes again. "Tell me exactly what you heard." His tone was clipped but not cruel, the tone of a man trying to control chaos by dissecting it. Emily's small brow furrowed as she replayed it. "They were near the car. One said, 'He starts the engine, we walk away.' The other laughed and said, 'No one will suspect us when the explosion happens.' They were speaking in Mandarin." She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "I learned it from my grandma. I don't know every word, but I know that." Richard glanced at Zhao, whose expression remained carved in professional calm. But there, just beneath the surface, flickered something. Surprise. Anger. It was gone too fast to be sure. Li Mei stepped closer, her gaze fixed on Richard, unflinching. "Children hear the things adults hide between words," she said quietly. "You built your world on trust. Yes. But trust can rot if you never look beneath it." The words landed heavier than she probably intended. For the first time that night, Richard felt the armor of certainty slip a little. This woman, this stranger, spoke to him not as a subordinate, not as a client, but as if she could see through him, as if she recognized the exact kind of man who mistakes control for safety. "You think you're safe because you pay for protection," she continued, folding her hands. "But sometimes the people you feed are the ones who wait for you to stop looking." That truth hit him like a faint echo from his own past. Years ago, he had ignored a warning about a business partner who later tried to bankrupt him. He had called it bad luck back then. Now he saw it for what it was, a pattern. "I can't just accuse them," he said, almost defensively. "Not without proof." Li Mei smiled softly. "Then find proof. But don't test it with your life." There was a long silence where everything felt suspended. The low hum of the lights, the chill of concrete, the faint rhythm of Emily's anxious breathing. In that pause, something ancient and practical in Richard stirred. He looked at David Miller, his one constant in a world of shifting loyalties. "David," he said, voice calm but edged with steel, "check the car, right now. Act like it's a routine inspection. I don't want questions." David's nod was crisp, immediate. He had seen that tone before, not fear, but decision. As David walked toward the sedan, the guard's eyes tracked him. Zhao's jaw tensed. Mark cleared his throat, a sound too casual to be casual. The faint buzz of fluorescent light deepened into something almost alive. Emily gripped her grandmother's sleeve, the fabric tightening in her fist. Li Mei didn't move. She kept her gaze on Richard, steady, unwavering. "When you doubt," she said softly, "listen to what makes you uncomfortable. That's where truth hides." He didn't answer, not out loud, but something shifted inside him. For the first time in years, Richard Cole, the man who thought in forecasts and spoke in margins, was guided not by numbers, but by instinct. It felt alien. It felt right. He straightened, buttoned his coat, and took a slow breath. "Stay close to her," he told Li Mei quietly, "no matter what happens." The old woman nodded once, solemn, as if acknowledging a ritual older than both of them. In that moment, she became more than just a bystander. She was the hinge between doubt and faith, between disbelief and action. Every hero's journey needs a compass. His had arrived wrapped in wool and wisdom, speaking softly enough for truth to sound like choice. And as David's footsteps echoed toward the waiting car, the garage seemed to exhale. Somewhere in the distance, a horn blared, just another city sound to anyone else. But to Richard, it felt like a signal. He realized, with a shiver he couldn't quite suppress, that something irreversible had already begun. The call had been made, the mentor had spoken, and whether he liked it or not, he was already crossing a line he could never uncross. The moment David Miller walked toward the car, the air seemed to thicken. Even the sound of his leather shoes against the concrete floor echoed differently, sharp and deliberate, like punctuation marks in a sentence no one wanted to finish reading. The dim lights flickered once, maybe from the draft of an opening door above, or maybe because tension can change the way light behaves. Richard Cole stood perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on his most trusted man, and for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about market shares or policy approvals. He was thinking about survival. The words of Grandma Li Mei echoed in his mind like an ancient rhythm. The truth hides where you feel most uncomfortable. Zhao, the Chinese-born guard whose calm had always bordered on mechanical, shifted slightly. It was a minor movement, just a hand brushing against his sleeve. But Richard noticed. He had built empires by noticing. Mark and Ian exchanged glances that were supposed to be invisible. Lucas, the youngest, still too honest to fake indifference, swallowed hard, the sound audible in the silence. David reached the car, running a gloved hand along its sleek exterior, as if checking for scratches. He bent, glanced inside, his reflection bending in the tinted window. Seconds stretched like wire, the kind of seconds that decide who lives and who doesn't. Richard inhaled through his nose, the faint scent of gasoline and polished steel stinging his senses. The world felt suddenly too still, too ordered. That kind of stillness never meant safety. It meant something was waiting to move. David crouched, kneeling near the front bumper, pretending to inspect the tire pressure. From this angle, his face was half hidden in shadow, but his shoulders stiffened. When he stood again, he didn't look back right away. He adjusted his cuff, a subtle, practiced motion, the exact signal Richard had told him years ago to use if a negotiation turned dangerous. A private code between them. Not safe. Richard's throat tightened. He stepped forward slightly. "Everything all right, David?" he asked, his tone carrying a controlled calm that betrayed the storm rising beneath it. David turned, his face pale but composed. "Sir," he said, voice steady, "I think there's something attached to the undercarriage." The words sliced through the air like a blade. Every muscle in the room responded. The guard straightening, Li Mei tightening her grip on Emily's shoulder, Emily's small gasp caught between fear and vindication. Zhao's jaw flexed. "Must be a mistake," he said too quickly. Richard's gaze snapped toward him. "Explain." Zhao hesitated, then smiled faintly, the kind of smile that belongs to men who think they still control the story. "Routine security device," he said. "Backup tracker." Richard stepped closer, the soles of his shoes whispering against the concrete. "Then why didn't I authorize it?" That was the first true crack. Silence flooded in, heavy and aware. The hum of the lights became a low drone, the city's distant traffic muffled by the building's thick bones. Richard wasn't a soldier, but he understood strategy, and right now, the strategy was simple: stall, observe, decide. He turned to David, who gave a barely perceptible shake of his head. Not safe, not a tracker. The certainty landed hard. Richard exhaled, the sound almost a sigh but sharper at the edges. "Step back from the car," he ordered. His voice was no longer calm, it was command. Authority stripped of its veneer, raw and direct. David obeyed instantly, taking 3 deliberate steps back. Emily, who had been silent until then, whispered, "I told you." Her voice trembled. not with pride, but with the realization that the nightmare she'd tried to stop was real. Richard didn't look at her yet. He couldn't. His focus was now on the men who had sworn to protect him. Mark, Ian, Zhao. "Lucas," he said, naming each one slowly, like a judge calling defendants. "You've worked for me long enough to know I don't make accusations without reason. So here's your chance. Tell me what's under that car." Zhao's smile faltered, replaced by something harder. Ian looked at Mark. Mark looked at the floor. Lucas shifted, his youth suddenly a liability. "Sir," he began, "maybe we should call it in." "No." Richard's voice cut clean through. "We're not calling anyone. Not yet." Li Mei spoke then, softly, but every syllable carried. "When the foxes grow quiet, the chickens should run." Emily gripped her hand tighter, eyes wide, chest rising fast. Richard glanced at her, and for the first time that night, something like gratitude flickered in his gaze. He realized, painfully, clearly, that this child and her grandmother had already saved his life once. But now the line between life and death, trust and betrayal, was razor thin. He took one careful step back, positioning himself closer to them. His mind calculated. 4 men, 1 armed, 2 possibly complicit, 1 unsure. He could feel the weight of decision pressing against his spine. "David," he said, voice lower now, almost a whisper, "don't take another step toward that car." And then, as if cued by fate, Zhao moved. Not much, just a twitch toward his jacket pocket, but enough to shatter the last illusion of control. David's hand went to his own side instinctively, but Richard raised his arm, stopping him. "Don't," he said sharply. "We're not playing that game." His tone cracked like thunder in the confined space, every pair of eyes fixed on him now. "You want this quiet? Then you tell me what I already know," he said, looking straight at Zhao. "That car is wired, isn't it?" The silence that followed was both confirmation and confession. Richard didn't need a yes. The truth had already crossed the line. He stepped backward, guiding Emily and Li Mei with a steady hand. The city outside might still be running, oblivious, but here, in the gray concrete belly of power, a man had just crossed from order into chaos. The world he controlled no longer obeyed. The threshold wasn't just a line on the floor, it was a fracture in reality. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a calm so deep it almost sounded foreign. "David," he said, "call internal security, quietly. Tell them to seal every exit." He glanced once more at Emily, the girl who had seen what he refused to see. "Stay close to me," he added, softer now, almost fatherly. And that was it. The moment everything changed. Richard Cole, master of logic and empire, had stepped off the polished floors of certainty and into the unpredictable terrain of truth. Behind him, the hum of the building seemed to fade, replaced by something deeper. The heartbeat of fear, the rhythm of decision, the sound of a man learning what it means to truly listen. Ahead, danger waited, but so did redemption. And whether he realized it or not, the journey had already chosen him. Fear does strange things to time. It stretches seconds into eternities and turns the sound of a single breath into an earthquake. The parking garage had gone silent, the kind of silence that listens back. Somewhere above them, the muffled city still pulsed with life. Car horns, laughter, a siren in the distance. But down here, deep beneath Coltec Tower, everything existed inside one fragile bubble of air, trembling with truth. Richard Cole's world, the world of contracts, conferences, and confidence, had collapsed into something primal, survival and trust. Only this time, trust had teeth. David Miller's hand lingered near his earpiece, waiting for the signal. He wasn't just an assistant anymore. In that moment, he was a soldier disguised as an executive. His eyes darted from Zhao to Mark, reading every flicker of muscle like code. "Sir," he said quietly, "if we call for backup, we lose control of the narrative." That was David's genius, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Richard knew he was right. News of a CEO nearly assassinated by his own guards would ripple through headlines faster than truth could catch up. Stockholders would panic, competitors would feast, and somewhere out there, whoever had hired these men would watch it all burn. "Not yet," Richard whispered. "We handle this in-house." Emily pressed closer to Lee May, her small hand gripping the old woman's coat. Her wide eyes reflected the harsh white lights above, like twin mirrors catching fragments of a world far too dangerous for innocence. She didn't fully understand corporate power or assassination plots, but she understood fear. She could taste it in the air, bitter like old coins. "Grandma," she whispered in Mandarin, "they're going to hurt him, aren't they?" Li Mei didn't answer immediately. Her gaze stayed fixed on Zhao, who stood like a statue carved from calculation. "Not if we move wisely," she murmured. Her tone was calm, but her hand trembled ever so slightly, betraying the weight of what she already knew. Danger never travels alone. Richard stepped forward again, breaking the invisible line that separated command from chaos. His voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Here's what's going to happen," he said, addressing everyone but looking directly at Zhao. "David will inspect the car again. You will stay where you are. If anyone moves without my order, I assume they're against me." It was a bluff. He wasn't sure if Zhao was armed, but he couldn't afford to show doubt. Zhao tilted his head slightly, eyes narrow, assessing. Then came a smile. Not wide, not friendly, but enough to make Richard's pulse quicken. "Mr. Cole," Zhao said in accented English, "you think you're in control? You never were." His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of something final. That's when it happened. The subtle flick of Zhao's wrist, the faint glint of metal. David reacted first. He lunged forward, kicking the object from Zhao's hand before the motion completed. The clatter of the small detonator hitting the concrete was deafening in the stillness. Emily flinched. Mark shouted something incoherent, grabbing Zhao's arm. For one suspended heartbeat, it looked as though loyalty had returned, until Mark's other hand went for the pistol under his jacket. Richard saw it all in fragments, the blur of motion, the flash of metal, David's shout, Emily's cry. Years of boardroom reflexes turned instinctual. He ducked low, pulling Emily and Li Mei behind one of the parked cars. The shot rang out sharp and final, embedding itself in the wall just inches from where his head had been. Chaos broke open like a dam. David tackled Mark, their struggle echoing off the concrete. Ian hesitated, gun half raised, torn between orders and conscience. Lucas froze, eyes darting between sides, too young to know what survival demanded. Zhao tried to recover the detonator, but Richard was faster than he thought. He grabbed a wrench from a nearby tool station, the first thing his hand touched, and swung it, not perfectly, but hard enough to send Zhao sprawling. "David," he shouted, "get the detonator." David rolled off Mark, blood at the corner of his mouth, and snatched the small device before Zhao could reach it. For a brief, burning moment, the entire garage became a battlefield, a silent war fought with breath, glare, and desperation. Li Mei, crouched behind the car with Emily, spoke softly into the chaos. "Courage, Emily. This is what it means to stand when others fall." The girl nodded, though her small frame trembled. She peeked over the hood, her heartbeat loud in her ears. Richard caught her gaze, just for a second, and in her eyes, he found something he'd forgotten existed in men like him. Belief. Not blind faith, but the stubborn kind that refuses to break. That single look steadied him more than adrenaline ever could. He straightened, his voice echoing through the garage like thunder. "Drop the weapons. It's over." The words carried an authority born not of wealth, but of truth. And for the first time, they listened. Ian lowered his gun first, stepping away slowly, both hands visible. Lucas followed, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. Mark groaned on the floor, one arm twisted beneath him, disarmed but alive. Zhao glared at Richard with the coldness of a man who had gambled and lost. "You don't understand," Zhao said, voice trembling with rage. "You think this ends here. Someone wanted this to happen. Someone bigger than me. Richard didn't flinch. He took a step forward, his shadow cutting across Zhao's face. "Maybe," he said evenly, "but right now, it ends with you." He glanced at David. "Secure him. Call internal. Quietly." David obeyed, his movements precise, practiced. The remaining guards stood down, shame replacing defiance. Emily emerged slowly from behind the car, clutching her grandmother's hand. "Is it over?" she asked. Richard looked at her, and for the first time that night, his voice softened. "Not yet," he said, "but we're still here. That's something." That was the test. Not the gun, not the bomb, not even betrayal. The test was whether he could let truth outweigh pride, whether he could listen to a child and survive because of it. In that moment, he realized the true nature of enemies and allies. Enemies hide in the comfort of certainty. Allies appear in the discomfort of truth. And though the danger had not yet fully passed, the lesson had already carved itself into him like a scar. Up above, the city continued, unaware, indifferent, alive. Down here, however, something fundamental had shifted. Richard Cole, for the first time in his meticulously ordered life, had chosen faith over logic. And that decision, reckless and raw, would save not just his life, but the last piece of his humanity still worth saving. The chaos had quieted, but silence wasn't safety. It was the space between storms. The smell of burnt rubber and gunpowder still hung in the air like the ghost of violence that refused to leave. The low hum of the city above them felt distant, unreal, a reminder that somewhere out there people were living ordinary lives, laughing, driving, making dinner. Down here, beneath the glittering skin of Manhattan, Richard Cole's world had narrowed to shadows, blood and the echo of his own heartbeat. Internal security had swept in quietly, just as he'd ordered. Men in dark suits who moved with the efficiency of those who understood that truth, once unleashed, spreads faster than bullets. Zhao, Mark, and Ian had been restrained, their weapons confiscated, their eyes still full of unspoken secrets. Lucas, the youngest of them, sat against the wall, head bowed, hands shaking. He hadn't spoken since the chaos ended, but guilt had already painted his face in pale regret. David Miller leaned against the car, a gash across his cheek, breathing hard. Richard turned to him, his voice low but firm. "Get medical down here, quietly, and make sure this doesn't reach the press." David nodded, already dialing, but Richard's gaze was distant. The questions were starting to multiply. Questions that couldn't be answered with corporate logic or a press statement. He stepped closer to Zhao, who sat cuffed, back against the cold concrete wall. "Who sent you?" Richard asked. Zhao didn't look at him. He looked through him. "You really don't know, do you?" he said, his lips curling into something between a smile and a sneer. "You make enemies when you build empires. Some of them don't wear suits." Richard's jaw tightened. "You're not helping yourself." Zhao laughed, short and hollow. "You think I care about myself. You think this ends because you stopped one car." His tone shifted, colder now. "You stopped the symptom, Mr. Cole, not the sickness." Those words stuck to the air like frost. Richard felt something inside him tighten, a recognition he didn't want to acknowledge. He'd spent years building alliances, buying silence, controlling outcomes. But somewhere along that path, he'd forgotten that power always grows roots underground. You can trim the tree, but the roots still spread. "Take him upstairs," Richard said finally, voice steady but distant. As security escorted Zhao away, the man turned one last time. "You'll never see it coming," he said softly. "Not next time." Emily and her grandmother stood a few steps behind, watching everything unfold. The little girl's eyes flicked between Richard and Zhao, her small face shadowed by confusion and something heavier, the dawning understanding that adults could be just as dangerous as the monsters children imagine under their beds. Li Mei placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "He's gone now," she whispered in Mandarin. "But the lesson stays." Richard turned to them, removing his blood-stained jacket and tossing it aside. "You shouldn't have to see any of this," he said, his voice rougher now, stripped of polish. Li Mei shook her head. "We see what life shows us," she replied softly, "even when it isn't fair." Emily looked up at him. "I just wanted to help," she said. The simplicity of it hit him harder than Zhao's words. He crouched down, looking her in the eyes. "You did more than help," he said. "You saved my life." Her lips quivered. "They wanted to hurt you because of money, right?" He hesitated. How could he explain the rot of greed to a child still learning about fairness? "Because of power," he said finally. "And power scares people who don't have it." The sound of sirens drifted faintly from above now. Backup, probably. Or maybe just another emergency in a city that never stopped breaking. But the noise was enough to make Richard's instincts flare again. "We're leaving," he told David. "Now, quietly." As they moved toward the elevator, the tension returned, not as panic, but as weight. The heavy awareness that danger doesn't end when enemies are caught. It ends when truth is faced. And that truth, he realized, wasn't about bombs or betrayal. It was about how easily he'd stopped listening to his own instincts, how quickly he'd traded intuition for data. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, revealing a dimly lit corridor that led to the executive floor. He stepped in first, motioning for Li Mei and Emily to follow. David entered last, pressing the button for the top floor. The doors closed, sealing them into a box of mirrors and silence. As they ascended, Richard caught his reflection. Not the magazine version of himself, not the power suit, not the mask of control, but the raw, exhausted face of a man who had seen how fragile his empire really was. "She's right, you know," Li Mei said suddenly, her voice gentle but firm. "About power. It's only dangerous when you believe it makes you untouchable." Richard turned toward her. "And you? What do you believe?" he asked. She smiled faintly. "I believe truth finds its way, even when people try to bury it." The elevator chimed again. The doors slid open to reveal the panoramic view of New York, the skyline blazing gold under the dying light. It should have been beautiful. Instead, it looked like a reminder. Everything he'd built could burn in an instant. Emily walked forward, her small hand grazing the glass. "It looks like the city is on fire," she said softly. Richard stared out, the words sinking deeper than she could have known. "Maybe it always was," he murmured. He stood there, watching the sun sink behind skyscrapers that looked suddenly smaller, weaker. The old world, the safe, predictable one, was gone. Ahead waited a darker truth, one he'd spent his life ignoring. That trust, once broken, can't simply be repaired. It has to be rebuilt, piece by fragile piece. And somewhere in that realization, the next trial awaited, the one that wouldn't threaten his life, but his soul. Night fell over New York like ink spilled across glass. The skyline burned with artificial constellations, each window reflecting a life, a story, a lie. But in the corner office of Coltech Tower, where power had once felt infinite, Richard Cole sat in the half-dark, staring at the faint glow of a single desk lamp. His tie was gone. His sleeves were rolled up. The man who used to command entire industries now looked like someone who'd crawled out of a battlefield instead of a boardroom. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the earlier chaos, mixed with the metallic tang of tension that refused to leave. Outside, the wind pressed against the glass with soft insistence, as if the world itself was asking, "What will you do now?" David Miller stood by the door, phone in hand, his expression unreadable. "Internal security confirmed the device," he said quietly. "It was real, wired to the ignition. Professional work." Richard didn't respond. He already knew. You could feel the truth in your bones long before someone handed it to you on paper. "What about Zhao?" he asked finally, voice low, detached. "Gone," David replied. "He's not talking. But, sir, this wasn't just about him. We traced a transaction from an offshore account, routed through 3 subsidiaries. Leads back to coal industry's own financial division. That made Richard's head snap up. You're saying someone inside the company paid for this? David hesitated. Someone high up. The silence that followed was thick enough to drown in the idea that betrayal had come not from strangers, but from his own inner circle, clawed at something raw inside him. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the floor-to-ceiling window, the city lights warping against his reflection. After all these years, he muttered, you build walls so high, and the ones who want to kill you learn to walk through the front door. There was no anger in his voice, just exhaustion, the kind of tired that seeps into your soul. He turned his gaze toward Emily and Lee May, who sat quietly near the seating area, wrapped in blankets one of the assistants had brought. Emily's small face looked pale under the fluorescent light. Her grandmother's hand rested gently on her shoulder, grounding her in a world that had just proven how fragile grown-ups really were. You should have gone home, Richard said softly. Lee May shook her head. Sometimes the storm doesn't let you leave until it's done with you, she replied, and yours is not done yet. Her words lingered in the room long after she stopped speaking. David cleared his throat. Sir, I can pull the files, cross-check the accounts, maybe? No, Richard interrupted. His voice cut clean through the air. This isn't about data anymore. This is about people. He stood, pacing slowly, the city's glow painting sharp lines across his face. Whoever did this, they weren't after money. They wanted control, to remind me that power isn't protection, it's a target. He stopped, staring at his own reflection again. And I let it happen. That was the moment it broke. The facade, the armor, the myth. For years he had built himself into an idea. Untouchable, unstoppable, invincible. But now, standing under the indifferent light of his own empire, he felt the weight of every decision that had ever traded trust for control. It wasn't just an assassination attempt. It was a mirror. And the man staring back at him was finally seeing himself without distortion. Do you know what's worse than betrayal? He said, almost to himself. Realizing you trained the people who betrayed you. Emily watched him, her small voice cutting through the silence. You didn't do it on purpose, she said softly. He turned, surprised. What? You didn't make them bad, she continued. You just forgot to look at them the way you look at people who aren't rich or important. Her innocence hit harder than any accusation could have. Lee May gave a faint nod. Wisdom from small mouths, she murmured. She sees truth before it becomes convenient. Richard's throat tightened. For a man who spent his life mastering conversation, he found himself speechless before a child. Then David's phone buzzed again. He answered, listened, and paled. Sir, we have a problem. There's been a breach in the executive server. Someone just accessed your private archives and remotely. Richard's blood ran cold. From where? We're still tracing it, David said, voice trembling slightly. But it looks like from within the building. The ordeal wasn't over. It had only changed form. This wasn't about bombs or bullets anymore. It was about exposure. Someone inside wanted to destroy him, not just physically, but publicly. To ruin everything he'd built from the inside out. Shut down every terminal, he ordered. Lock the system. David hesitated. That means cutting off. Do it, Richard barked. His voice carried the authority of a man reclaiming command through necessity. If we lose data, we lose it. But we don't lose control. The room erupted into motion. David sprinted toward the control console. Alarms flickered to life, subtle, muted, but urgent. Emily clung to her grandmother, eyes wide. Grandma, what's happening? The truth, Lee May whispered. It's trying to come out. And then, like a cruel echo of the night's earlier terror, the lights flickered, once, twice, before plunging the room into darkness. The hum of the servers stopped. The city outside glowed brighter by contrast, its reflection bleeding across the windows. For a moment, No one moved. Then Richard heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching from the hallway outside. His pulse thundered in his ears. "David," he whispered, "is that security?" David didn't answer. The door handle turned. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to fight, to act. But before he could move, the door swung open, and a silhouette stepped into the room. The light from the city framed the figure, faceless but familiar. A voice, calm and venomous, filled the space. "You should have stayed in the car, Richard." It wasn't Zhao, it wasn't an outsider. It was someone far worse, someone Richard knew. The true enemy had finally stepped into the light. And in that moment, Richard understood. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was the reckoning. The moment that would decide not just his fate, but the kind of man he would be if he lived to see dawn. The door closed behind the shadowed figure with a soft click that echoed louder than any explosion could have. The shape moved forward, slow and deliberate, the glow of the city outlining the edges of an expensive suit. As the figure stepped into the pale moonlight that spilled across the office floor, Richard's breath caught. The face that emerged wasn't a stranger's. It was Daniel Crane, his chief financial officer, his partner of 15 years, the man who had once toasted him at his wedding and sworn loyalty over 1,000 late-night strategy sessions. For a heartbeat, Richard couldn't process it. "Daniel." His voice cracked, not from fear, but disbelief. The betrayal wasn't an attack. It was personal, surgical. The kind of betrayal that could only come from someone who knew where the armor was thin. Daniel gave a small, almost pitying smile. "You were never going to see it coming," he said softly. "That's what makes you dangerous, Richard. You believe in loyalty as if it can't be bought." David stepped forward, gun drawn, stance steady. "Don't move." But Daniel didn't even flinch. "Relax, David," he said, turning his eyes toward him. "You really think this ends with a trigger? The files are already out. Your boss's empire is done." The words hung heavy in the air, thick with finality. Richard's pulse thundered. He could feel the heat of rage rise from his chest to his jaw, but beneath it was something colder, clarity. "You tried to kill me," Richard said, his voice quiet but lethal. "You could have just taken the company." Daniel's smirk deepened. "And leave you breathing? No, Richard. You don't share power. You consume it. You taught us that." It was true. Richard had always believed in winning, ruthlessly, completely. He'd crushed competitors, bought out friends, and justified it all as strategy. But standing here, staring into the eyes of his former ally turned executioner, he saw himself reflected back, not as the hero, not even as the victim, but as the architect of his own ruin. He had built a machine that rewarded greed, and now it had learned to eat its master. The room was thick with tension. David's finger hovered near the trigger. Lee May and Emily stood motionless near the corner, witnesses to something raw and ancient, the death of a man's illusions. Daniel took another step forward. "You see, I didn't need to destroy you. I just needed to show the world what you really are. Arrogant, isolated, weak enough to trust a child's story before your own men." That last word, child, snapped something inside Richard. His eyes flicked toward Emily, small and trembling but still defiant, her grandmother's arm around her. That little girl had seen truth before he had. She'd saved him not just from death, but from himself. And suddenly, something shifted deep within him. The fear melted into resolve, the kind that doesn't come from anger, but from understanding. He straightened his back, the calm of decision settling over him like armor. "You're right, Daniel," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "I was arrogant. I thought loyalty could be bought, that people would stay because I paid them enough. I built walls and called them protection." He took a step closer, unarmed, unafraid. "But you know what I learned tonight. The people who save you are never the ones who have to. They're the ones who choose to—" Daniel hesitated, confusion flickering in his expression. That wasn't the reaction he expected. "What are you doing, Richard?" he asked, his voice suddenly less certain. Richard smiled faintly, ending this the right way. Without breaking eye contact, he reached for the intercom button on his desk. "Security," he said calmly. "Activate lockdown protocol." "Priority Alpha." A deep hum filled the room as reinforced doors slid shut with a hydraulic hiss. Daniel spun toward the door, realizing too late that his exit was gone. "You just locked yourself in with me," he snarled. Richard's eyes didn't waver. "No, I locked you in with yourself." David moved then, swift, controlled, disarming Daniel with a precision that came from years of silent readiness. The gun clattered to the floor, sliding across the marble until it stopped at Lee May's feet. Emily flinched but didn't scream. Daniel lunged, but Richard caught his arm mid-swing. The two men colliding like forces of nature, past and present, greed and guilt, ambition and consequence. The fight wasn't elegant. It wasn't cinematic. It was real, messy, raw, desperate. The sound of fists against flesh, the grunt of exertion, the sharp exhale of a man reclaiming his dignity. Finally, Richard shoved Daniel backward. He stumbled into the glass wall, which cracked but didn't break. The lights flickered again, throwing fractured reflections across their faces. Daniel slumped, defeated, breathing heavily. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat. Richard shook his head. "No, it just means I finally stopped pretending to be one." He gestured toward David. "Call the police. Full disclosure. Every file, every payment, every deal he touched. No cover-ups." David hesitated, shocked. "Sir, that'll expose—" "Everything," Richard finished for him. "Yes, that's the point." The old Richard Cole would have protected the company, buried the truth, and spun a new narrative by morning. But this version, reborn through fire, fear, and a little girl's courage, knew better. The only way to reclaim his soul was to lose the illusion of control. Lee May stepped forward, her eyes calm and knowing. "You learned faster than most," she said softly. "The powerful rarely survive the truth, but you did. That's rare." Richard turned to her, exhausted but sincere. "She's the reason," he said, nodding toward Emily. "She saw what I couldn't." Emily managed a small, shy smile. "Grandma says when you see something bad, you can't just look away." Richard nodded, kneeling so his eyes met hers. "And she's right. You taught me that." For the first time that night, he smiled, not the rehearsed corporate smile, but something real, human, fragile. Outside, the city kept glowing, unaware that somewhere inside one of its tallest towers, a man had finally decided to stand for something true. The police arrived 20 minutes later. Daniel Crane was taken away in silence. David handled the statements. Lee May and Emily were escorted to a waiting car. Richard stood alone in his office, the skyline before him and the dawn just beginning to break behind it. It was over, but not really. It was only just beginning, because redemption doesn't end when the danger does. It begins when you decide to rebuild what was broken, with honesty, not pride. He turned to the window one last time. The reflection that stared back wasn't the billionaire who'd walked into this day. It was the man who had almost died learning what truth costs. And this time, he didn't look away. Morning arrived slowly, bleeding gold through the steel and glass veins of Manhattan. The storm of the night had finally passed. But the silence that followed carried its own kind of gravity, the kind that settles after survival, when the air still smells faintly of adrenaline and smoke. In the corner office of Coltech Tower, sunlight caught the edges of shattered glass like a halo, a silent monument to the night Richard Cole almost died. He stood near the window, jacket gone, shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, watching the city wake. The streets below glimmered with movement, taxis, morning joggers, people chasing coffee and deadlines, all blissfully unaware that somewhere above them, a man was quietly rewriting his destiny. The skyline had always looked like victory to him before. Now, it looked like consequence. The police had come and gone. The scene was cleaned, reports filed, footage secured. Daniel Crane's betrayal would soon make headlines. There was no stopping that now. Richard didn't want to stop it. For once, The truth would run its course unchained, even if it tore through his empire like fire. And it would. He knew that. Stocks would plummet. Boards would panic. The vultures, journalists, competitors, former allies, would circle before noon. But the man who had spent decades building walls of secrecy now stood ready to tear them down with his own hands. David entered quietly, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You look like you haven't slept," he said. Richard managed a small smile. "I didn't." His voice was hoarse but calm, the calm of someone who had already made peace with the storm. "The press is outside," David continued. "They're asking for a statement. About the attempt, the arrests, Crane." Richard turned from the window, took the coffee, and sat. "Good," he said. "Let them ask." David blinked, caught off guard. "You want to talk to them?" Richard nodded. "I want to tell them the truth." That was the first time in years he'd said those words without a strategy attached. No PR team, no spin, no manipulation, just raw honesty. It scared him more than the bomb had. As David left to make arrangements, Richard's eyes drifted toward the doorway, where Lee May and Emily stood quietly. They had stayed the night at his insistence, a gesture of gratitude and, perhaps, protection. Emily looked small against the backdrop of the city, her green coat slightly rumpled, her eyes still wide with the residue of danger. But there was light there now, something gentle and steady, like hope. He walked toward her, kneeling slightly so they were eye level. "Do you know what happens now?" he asked softly. She shook her head. "You're going to be on TV," she guessed. He smiled faintly. "Yes, but not to be famous." She frowned. "Then why?" He paused, searching for words that could fit the weight of the lesson. "Because hiding the truth almost cost me everything. Sometimes the only way to fix things is to tell people exactly what went wrong, even if it hurts." Lee May's voice floated in from behind. "Pain cleans deeper than pride," she said. "And truth, once spoken, becomes armor." He looked at her, grateful in a way he couldn't express. "You were right about me," he admitted. "I built my life on control, on fear." She smiled knowingly. "Then rebuild it on courage." Outside, the faint hum of reporters and camera crews grew louder. The world was waiting. Richard straightened his tie, not out of vanity, but ritual, and turned to David, who had returned with a microphone. "They're ready," David said quietly. Richard nodded. As he stepped into the lobby, the flashes began, a sea of questions thrown like arrows. But this time, he didn't dodge. He didn't hide behind PR language. His voice carried across the crowd, measured but steady. "Yes, there was an attempt on my life," he began. "And yes, it came from within my own company. That is the truth." A murmur rippled through the reporters, cameras snapping like firecrackers. "For years," he continued, "I built something I thought was unbreakable. I believed loyalty could be bought and safety could be guaranteed by money. I was wrong. Last night, a young girl reminded me that honesty isn't weakness. It's the only thing strong enough to save you." He gestured slightly toward Emily, who stood just inside the building, watching him through the glass doors. She had the courage to speak when others stayed silent. And because she did, I'm alive. I owe her my life, and I intend to spend the rest of it earning that second chance. The reporters fell silent. It was rare to hear that kind of truth from a man like Richard Cole. The kind of confession that didn't sound rehearsed. It wasn't. It was real, stripped down to the bone, raw and human. When the press conference ended, he returned inside. Emily ran up and hugged him tightly, the innocence of the gesture undoing him in a way no tragedy ever had. "You did good," she said softly. He laughed, a sound that carried both release and relief. "No," he said, his voice breaking slightly. "You did good." The day moved forward. Meetings, statements, calls. The machine of life resumed, but the man running it was no longer the same. The road back wasn't about restoring what was lost. It was about becoming someone who deserved to survive. That evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Richard stood by the window again. The city glowed, alive and untamed, and for once he didn't see it as something to conquer. He saw it as something to understand. Behind him, Lee May and Emily were preparing to leave. "Where will you go?" he asked. Lee May smiled. "Where truth is needed," she said. "It always finds us." Emily waved, her small hand trembling slightly. "Will we see you again?" Richard knelt, meeting her gaze. "You already will," he said, tapping her chest gently. "Every time I tell the truth, you'll be there." As the elevator doors closed behind them, the room felt quieter, but not empty. The kind of quiet that follows clarity. Richard Cole exhaled slowly, a man reborn in the ruins of his own creation. The road back had begun, not toward the world he'd left behind, but toward the one he was finally brave enough to build. And outside, as night settled again over the glittering maze of the city, the words Lee May had spoken whispered back through his thoughts like a promise. Truth, once spoken, becomes armor. There's a moment that comes after every storm, a deceptive stillness when the air feels clean again, yet the scent of thunder still lingers. That was where Richard Cole found himself a week after the night that almost ended his life. The world had moved on, as it always does. Headlines had burned bright and faded. The stock market had taken its bite, but Coltech still stood, bruised, smaller, but alive. What wasn't the same, though, was the man running it. He sat alone in his office, not at his desk, but on the couch by the window. No suit, no armor, just a man, a notebook, and the sunrise. For years, mornings had been mechanical for Richard. Gym, espresso, headlines, deals. But now, each sunrise felt like a small miracle, a quiet reminder that he still had time to get it right. The chaos had stripped away the noise, the false certainty, and what was left was something raw and human. Yet beneath that fragile peace, a restlessness still pulsed. Because he knew the story wasn't over. Not yet. The public loved a redemption arc, but redemption isn't public, it's private. It happens when no one's watching, when you're face to face with your own reflection, and you have to decide who you really are. And that test came sooner than Richard expected. That morning, David walked in with an envelope, heavy, sealed, marked confidential. He set it on the table without a word. Richard frowned. "What's this?" "The final report," David said quietly. "The board wants to move forward. They've made a recommendation." Richard opened the envelope. Inside was a single-page document. His eyes scanned the words, and a cold weight settled in his chest. Board recommendation. Immediate resignation of Richard Cole as CEO of Coltech Industries. He read it twice, then a third time, as if the words would rearrange themselves into something merciful. They didn't. After everything, the truth, the confession, the rebuilding, they still wanted him gone. David's voice was gentle. "They think it's the only way to stabilize the company. Crane's trial is hurting investor confidence. They want a clean slate." Richard stared out the window, the city a blur of motion and indifference. "I tell the truth," he said softly, "and I lose everything." David hesitated. Maybe not everything. But Richard wasn't angry. He felt something deeper, a strange calm that came from understanding. The test wasn't to win back his company. It was to see whether he'd cling to what power remained, or finally let it go. He stood, walking slowly toward his desk. The same desk where he'd signed deals worth billions. The same desk where he'd built an empire that nearly consumed him. He ran his hand along the polished wood, tracing invisible lines of memory. Then, without hesitation, he picked up his pen and signed the resignation letter. David looked stunned. "You're just walking away." Richard smiled faintly. "For the first time in my life, David, I'm not walking away from something. I'm walking toward something." He handed over the paper. "This company will survive. It has good people. But I built it on fear. You'll build it on something better." David took the letter, emotion tightening his throat. "What will you do now?" Richard turned back toward the window. the morning light catching the lines on his face. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But for once, I'm not afraid to find out." That afternoon, he left Coltec Tower without security, without an entourage, without the shadow of who he used to be. The city was alive, taxis honking, street vendors calling, people rushing to live their small, beautiful lives. For the first time, he didn't feel above it all. He felt part of it. As he walked, he found himself drawn to a familiar corner, the cafe across from Central Park. It was the same cafe where he'd first met Li Mei and Emily a week earlier, when they came to see him one last time. He pushed open the door, the small bell chiming overhead. There they were. Emily was sitting at a table by the window, her hair pulled into a messy ponytail, crayons scattered across the table. Li Mei was sipping tea, her posture serene as ever. When Emily saw him, her face lit up. "Mr. Cole," she said, jumping from her seat. She ran up and hugged him tightly, almost knocking the coffee out of his hand. He laughed, a sound that felt cleaner, freer than it had in years. "Hey, kid," he said, kneeling to her level. "How's school?" "Boring," she said immediately, making Li Mei chuckle. "But Grandma says boring means safe." Li Mei looked up at him, eyes warm and knowing. "You look lighter," she said. "Did you finally put down what you were carrying?" He nodded. "All of it." She smiled, setting her cup down. "Then the world will finally have space to give you something new." They sat together for a while, talking about small things. Emily's art, Li Mei's memories of China, the quiet beauty of ordinary mornings. There was no mention of Coltec, no whispers of power or betrayal, just three people sharing the simple grace of being alive. At one point, Emily looked at him curiously. "Do you miss it?" "Being important." Richard thought about it for a long moment, then shook his head. "No," he said finally. "I think I just started being important in a different way." Outside, sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering gold patterns on the table. It was quiet, peaceful, but not empty, the kind of quiet that follows truth. As they left the cafe, Emily handed him a small folded piece of paper. "I drew this for you," she said. He unfolded it. It was a child's sketch of a tall man standing beside a little girl under a bright yellow sun. Above them, in wobbly handwriting, it read, "Sometimes, listening saves lives." He swallowed hard, smiling through the sting in his eyes. "It's perfect," he said. "Can I keep it?" She nodded proudly. "Forever." And as he walked away down the bustling New York street, no entourage, no headlines, no empire, Richard Cole carried that crumpled drawing in his hand. It wasn't a symbol of loss. It was a reminder. Rebirth doesn't happen when the world forgives you. It happens when you forgive yourself. The city hummed around him, alive and unbroken. Somewhere behind him, the little girl laughed, and for the first time in a long time, Richard laughed too, not as a man who had survived, but as one who had finally begun to live. The morning breeze carried a crispness that only spring in New York could hold, the kind that hinted at new beginnings without needing to say a word. The city was alive again, pulsing with its usual rhythm of ambition and chaos. But for Richard Cole, the world had slowed into something different, deliberate, sacred, beautifully human. A month had passed since his resignation, and though the headlines had long since shifted to new scandals, whispers of his fall from grace still fluttered through the business world. He no longer read the papers. He didn't need to. For once, he wasn't trying to control the story. He was simply living it. That morning, Richard stood at the entrance of a modest community center in Brooklyn, a building with peeling paint, uneven floors, and laughter leaking through its windows. The sign above the door read, "The Li Mei Foundation for Truth and Courage." It was his idea, but her name. He had insisted. Inside, children were gathered around tables, sketching, reading, building things from scraps of cardboard and hope. There was noise, the good kind, the kind that fills the air with life. At the center of it all was Emily, wearing a paint-streaked apron and holding a brush like a sword. She turned when she saw him and beamed. "Mr. Cole!" she shouted, waving. He smiled, setting down the boxes of donated supplies he'd carried. "What are you working on today?" She pointed proudly at a half-painted mural on the wall. It showed a city skyline under a rising sun, with a little girl and a tall man standing at its center. Above them were the words, "Truth is the light that saves us." He stood silently for a moment, taking it in. The simplicity of it broke him a little every time, not in pain, but in awe. Li Mei approached from behind, her calm presence as grounding as always. She carried 2 cups of tea. "You've been coming here every day," she said, handing him one. "You could be anywhere, doing anything. Why this?" Richard looked around the room, the laughter, the chatter, the smell of paint and purpose. "Because this," he said softly, "is the first thing I've ever built that isn't about me." She smiled, eyes twinkling. "Then you finally learned what power really is." He nodded. "Power isn't what you hold. It's what you give." For the first time in his life, he felt weightless. No shareholders, no deadlines, no bodyguards whispering behind him. Just the hum of real life, honest, unpredictable, meaningful. Later that afternoon, he sat outside on the steps of the center, watching Emily play with a group of kids. She was different now, more confident, more open. Her courage had inspired others, even if she didn't know it. She'd become a quiet leader, the kind that changes the world not with noise, but with example. He pulled from his coat pocket the crumpled drawing she'd given him weeks ago, the one that read, "Sometimes, listening saves lives." The paper was worn now, but he kept it close, like a compass that pointed him toward who he was meant to be. For years, Richard had lived chasing control, but now he found peace in surrender, in listening, in giving, in being part of something larger than his ego. That was the elixir he brought back from his journey, the understanding that the greatest wealth isn't power, it's truth. The sun began to set, washing the city in gold. Emily came running up the steps, slightly out of breath, holding a small envelope. "We made this for you," she said, handing it over with both hands. He opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten note signed by all the children. It read, "Thank you for teaching us that brave doesn't mean big. It means honest." For a long moment, he couldn't speak. His throat tightened, and he blinked against the warmth rising behind his eyes. He looked at Emily. "No," he said finally, voice soft but steady. "You taught me that." Li Mei joined them, standing just behind, her eyes glimmering with the kind of pride that only wisdom can hold. "Do you see, Richard?" she said. "This is what truth does. It doesn't end with one life saved. It ripples outward, saving 1,000 more." The sound of laughter floated up from the street, vendors calling, cars honking, life continuing as it always had. But for Richard, the city had changed forever. He turned to Li Mei. "You once told me truth becomes armor," he said. "You were right, but it's also something else." She raised a brow. "Oh, what's that?" "It's freedom." For a while, they sat there in silence, watching the sky fade into twilight. The city lights began to flicker on, one by one, until the whole skyline shimmered like a constellation. Richard took a deep breath, feeling the weight of gratitude settle over him. For the second time in his life, he whispered a quiet promise, not to his company, not to his ambition, but to himself. "Never again will I mistake power for purpose. Never again will I silence the truth, mine or anyone else's." Behind him, Emily's laughter rang through the night like music. That was the sound of life. Not survival, not control, but living. He stood brushing the dust from his coat and looked one last time at the mural inside the center. The words gleamed faintly under the warm lights. "Truth is the light that saves us." He smiled, turned to Li Mei and Emily, and said, "Come on, let's go home." As they walked away, the city hummed its endless song, the same song it had always sung. But now, to Richard, every note meant something new. Because in the end, the hero's journey isn't about conquering dragons or empires. It's about conquering yourself. And when you finally do, the world, loud, flawed, and magnificent, becomes your elixir. And somewhere deep inside, in the quiet chambers of his heart, Richard Cole knew this. Truth didn't just save his life. It gave him one worth living.